So good to have everybody here today. Several of you may have heard that Reggie's grandfather passed away last week, and the funeral was on Wednesday. And I was asked by the family to help with the funeral, and it was a reminder of the importance of faith and family. Those were two things that really came across, and it also reminds me, no matter what funeral I go to, it reminds me of the certainty of death. Death is coming. It is here, and we don't know when, we don't know how, so we've got to be ready. Last week, our sermon was about thank God, not food. Today is about fear God, not man. And a couple of weeks ago, we talked about fear a little bit, in that if you remember the apostles, before the resurrection, Jesus was arrested, they ran away. They were afraid, they were staying away. Jesus was crucified, but after the resurrection, there was something different about the apostles. Now, they were being commanded not to preach about Jesus, and they go right back out there and preach. They said, we're going to whip you, and they go back out there and preach. And eventually, they're going to kill them, and the people still go back out there that see it happening and still go out and preach. Our knowledge helps us to get a better understanding of death and really how serious it is and how it should control or not control our lives. So this morning we're going to examine how God empowers us to be courageous in the face of fear of what man can do to us. So Jesus is going to give 3 commands of don't fear, and one of what to fear. That's what we're going to look at in Matthew chapter 10, verses starting in verse 24. And as Dean just got through reading, all the way through verse 39. And I appreciate our men who lead us and help us in our worship. So the first point that we're going to see that Jesus commands is found in verse 25 when... Well, coming off of verse 25, the very first command in verse 26, go to verse 26, you will see this, and if you're an underliner in your Bible, you'll see 4 times he's going to use the word fear in just, 5, 6 verses. He's going to use the word fear 4 times. Number 1 in verse 26, therefore do not fear them. For there is nothing concealed that will not be revealed, or hidden that will not be known. You're saying, what do you mean not to fear them? Well, if you look up in verse 25, Jesus says, it is enough for the disciple that he become like his teacher and the slave like his master. This is the part I want you to pay attention to. If they have called the head of the house Beelzebul, how much more will they malign or speak against you who are the members of the household? So in other words, Jesus is saying if they will speak about Jesus as being the prince of demons, Beelzebul, they're like, he's the prince of demons. If they're going to say that about him, and he's the teacher, or he's the head of the household, what do you think they're going to say about the students? What do you think they're going to say about the servants in the household? Right? If they're willing to say that about the leader and the more powerful one, what are they going to do about the followers and the lesser ones? Obviously, they're going to say the same thing like that. If they're willing to call him the prince of demons, then what do you think they're going to say about you? So that's why Jesus says in verse 26, don't fear them. Like they're going to say this about you. They're going to insult you. And the Bible talks about protecting a good name. It's important to have a good name. We're supposed to try to protect our name, our reputation. That's valuable. The Bible talks about that over and over. But when you start speaking truth, when you start speaking against what is wrong, then it says they will say all kinds of evil against you. Matthew chapter 5, verse 11 When Jesus says how blessed you are, when people say all kinds of evil against you, when you're basically doing what Jesus wants you to do. So he says, don't fear them, because there's nothing concealed that will not be revealed. Now I was think about not seeing. What you can't see will be seen. And then he says, what will be whispered will be spoken on the rooftops. So what can't be seen will be seen. What can't be heard will be heard, is ultimately. And there was a couple of different ways that people were looking at this. And one of them is, there are people that may say bad things about you, but that will come to light. The truth will become known. So don't fear that. It might not come known here on this earth. I mean, you may have a bad reputation. People still talk bad about Jesus to this day. But the truth is going to be known. And so you sometimes look at people and you're saying, well, they got away with it. No, they won't. And sometimes it seems like I'm not getting my recognition. Yes, you will. So just don't fear people. But the other thing that Jesus is saying here is he says, what I whispered in your ear, verse 27, I want you to proclaim on the housetops. If you look at how Jesus started his kingdom, such a small place. If you guys look on the world globe, how big is Israel? How big is Jerusalem? And to start off with 12 disciples, I mean, what is that? He's just starting off with something small. It was really in secret almost, something small, obscure. It was not known. It wasn't big and flashy. But he says, what I'm whispering to you guys, I want you to go out in there and proclaim it from the housetops, right? I want everybody to know, right? I want everybody to know this. And so this is what Jesus is saying here, is that, yes, you may be misrepresented, but the truth will ultimately come out. And I want you to tell the truth about Jesus. Tell the story. Don't fear what people are going to say. And he's also going to give us of reasons not to fear man. Number one, don't fear man because the truth will come out, which is what we've just said. The truth will be revealed. It will become known. So don't fear that your reputation is going to be hidden. Number two, don't fear man because you're helping confront people's sins. You're helping to confront their lostness. And I thought this was interesting, and it is tough for us to confront people in a good way. Christianity gets a bad name because if people want to call out others and their sins and they enjoy it, I like feeling higher and I'm calling out your sin. That's not what this is talking about. God wants truth. And sin is what brings destruction and pain and suffering. And when somebody is living in that type of lifestyle, he wants his people to confront that. And the story that came to mind was Saul. Saul was killing Christians. He was persecuting Christians, and Jesus confronted him on the way to go in and get more Christians. He confronted him and he says, what you're doing is wrong. Why are you persecuting me? Why are you going against me? And so Paul's like, who are you, Lord? And then Jesus teaches him. And so he was confronted in his sin. Those who are confronted in their sin will do one of two things. In Acts chapter 2, it says they were cut to their heart and they repented and they were baptized for the forgiveness of their sins. But then by the time you get to Acts chapter 3 or 4, maybe 5, they were also cut to the heart when they were confronted with their sins. And it says they gnashed their teeth and they were furious. And they whipped the apostles. They were ready to kill them. Well, it was Stephen, and they did kill him, right? They did kill him in Acts chapter 6. So one of two things is going to happen. Either they will repent, or they are going to be upset And that's where we can become afraid, as they start to say bad things about us. So Jesus is saying, don't be afraid, because most people don't make a change. Most people don't make a change if there is no resistance. Why do bullies like to pick on the weak ones? Because there's no resistance. Once there's resistance, then they will stop. You see, usually they won't pick on those who are standing up against them. And when we think about poor work ethic or somebody stealing at work, if there's no resistance and nobody says anything, guess what? They'll just keep on doing it. But if you stand up and you say something about that, you speak up against that, then is the company grateful for that? Yes, because now money's not getting stolen or somebody's not cheating on their time. But that person's not going to like you. They're not going to like you. But what if that was your company? Would you appreciate it if somebody was stealing from you and somebody came and said, hey, Joe over here is stealing from the company? You know, then you would say, man, thank you for telling me. But now Joe doesn't like you because you narked on him, right? You snitched on him, whatever, right? So there's when we think about this attitude, Jesus says, don't fear them. And he gives an example of an argument from the greater to the lesser. There's different ways of trying to get a point across. And we talked about this earlier, that if they attacked Jesus' character, who is greater than us, then doesn't it make sense that they will attack us, who are the lesser? So that's a way of helping us to get the point across that if Jesus didn't get away with people accusing him, if he didn't get away with people saying false things against him, then doesn't it make sense they're going to do that to the lesser, to his followers? And so he gives it as the slave is not above his master, verse 24, and the disciple is not above his teacher, verse 25. We are not to change our behavior towards God because of the fear that we have of what people may do to ruin our name or our reputation. I don't know if that makes sense, right? We're not to change our behavior based upon what we think somebody's going to do or say against us, right? I'm not to fear them and it's going to persuade me to not do what's right. That's the mentality, that's the attitude that we have to have. Number 2, Jesus commands, don't fear man who can kill your body. Verse 28, he says, don't fear. This is the second time he uses this. Don't fear those who kill the body, but are unable to kill the soul. But rather fear God, who is able to destroy both soul and the body in hell. There are people who have the power to kill the body, and they can threaten us. Again, we're very thankful in America. We've been blessed. It might not last even in our lifetime. We don't know. But there are people right now that are threatened by being thrown in jail, by being beaten, or being killed in this world right now for their faith. To show up to worship this morning, they're being threatened. They're being threatened with pain, suffering, and even death, physical death, right? And so think about that this morning, would you have come to worship if you thought this could be your last day? Like, I might get killed today by going and worshiping God. This might be my last time seeing my family. I might get thrown in jail for going to worship this morning. Would I still come? Would I still come if I had that kind of fear of losing? But this is a priority for us. See, death and pain has always been used to intimidate people. Bullies, getting back to bullies, right? Give me your lunch money or else I will beat you up. I will bring pain on you, right? That's the threat is pain, right? The threat is pain. That's what I'm going to hold against you. It would be normally, I would not normally give my money to him. You know, like I wouldn't just walk up and say, here's my lunch money. That's not what I normally would do. So he's pressuring me, or her, she's pressuring me to do something I wouldn't normally do on the threat of fear, pain, death, those kinds of things, right? So God tells us, don't fear man, because they are unable to kill the soul. What's really most valuable? Our soul. What can man do to your soul? Nothing. Now, they can torture you. They can bring extreme pain and discomfort to your life. Believe me, that is true. But they cannot take your soul. And so that's why he says, don't fear man. They're limited in what they can do. And number two, don't fear man, because we are not to be changing our behavior towards God because of our fear of physical death. So if you think about physical death that they were being faced with, what are we facing today? COVID, right? So COVID is something that we could be faced with death. So does it change our behavior of what I normally wouldn't do something, but because of the threat of pain and death, then I'm going to change my behavior towards God? Could we make a correlation? Could we make a similarity that man is threatening me with pain and death, and so I'm not going to do something that God would want me to do? But what about COVID? Is it kind of the same threat? You know, and so I try to do a few statistics, and please, everybody is in different situations, okay? So I'm just trying to help us understand an overall perspective. I looked at some of the CDC's numbers in the last couple of days, so it changes, but basically 80% of all deaths are over the age of 65. If you're over the age of 65, that is 80% of all COVID deaths. That's 16% of the population. 16%. 16% of the population makes up 80% of all COVID deaths, right? If you're under the age of 44, the chances of you dying is 0.003%. In other words, you have a 99.997 chance of living. The chance of you living from COVID, if you're under 44, is 99.997%. That's what the numbers are showing us. So as we think about this, I try to compare that to some other statistics. If you're under the age of 44, there have been 7,000 COVID deaths. In that same amount of time, there's approximately 22,000 suicides. If you're under the age of 44. That means that you're 3 times more likely to die of suicide than of COVID. If we think about our young people, there are more young people dying of suicide than there are of COVID. How much effort, how much attention, how much energy is being put into helping to save our youth? And I didn't put it in the stats here, but here's the thing. If you look under the age of 24, you are 14 times more likely to die of of suicide than of COVID. Are 24 and under, you're 14 times more likely to die of suicide than of COVID. We have to look at where our focus of fear and death, because ultimately people have lost hope with suicide, losing hope because of their future of looking at the future of their life is full of pain and suffering, and therefore I don't want that. And I lose hope of life, and I don't have a hope of Christ. So we are to fear God instead. Don't fear man that he can kill the body. Don't fear what can kill the body, but rather fear God. That's what Jesus says. This is his third time he uses the word fear. But rather fear him who is able to destroy both soul and body in hell. You see, we're supposed to fear God, number one, because he can kill both body and soul in hell. Number two, found in verse 33, why should we fear God? Because he says that whoever denies me before men, I will deny him before my Father who is in heaven. Now that's fearful. Can you imagine Jesus saying, I don't know him. He is not a part of my family. Can you imagine how scary that would be? To say, depart from me, I never knew you. That's what Jesus says in Matthew chapter 7, depart from me, I never knew you. You see, that's what Jesus says. If we deny him, then he will deny us. And denying can happen in a couple of different ways. One, we can just flat out say, I don't know Jesus, like Peter did. Like, I don't know the man. Or it can happen through silence, that I just don't want to speak up, right? So denying can happen in two different ways. Number three, we can see why to fear God is because it says that he brings the sword of truth that will divide even families, verses 34 through 36. He says, I didn't come to bring peace. I came to bring a sword. When I speak truth and when you speak truth, it will divide families. That's fearful. To think that what Jesus is bringing can even divide families, because he is the Prince of Peace. He is wanting peace, but truth is divisive. When people don't want truth, if we don't want truth, then it begins to divide us even in our own families, and that's fearful. We've got to fear God, because he says, if you don't hate father, mother, brother, sister, and even your own life, you're not worthy of me, right? And that's point number 4. He says he will judge those who are unworthy and who don't put him first. Verse 37 through 38. If he says you are unworthy to be my disciple, that is a scary thought. He is the judge. He is the final say-so. And so we've got to fear him above all things. Point number 3, don't fear. This is the third time Jesus will say, don't fear. And he doesn't give us what not to fear. He just says, don't fear. Verse 31, don't fear. Why? You are more valuable than many sparrows. What do you mean? You see, Jesus is ultimately going to give 2 examples to balance out the fear of God. We just got through hearing about, man, you better fear God. And this word for fear is phobos, like phobia. I don't know what you guys' phobia are, but some people are arachnophobia. I mean, they are petrified of spiders. I mean, you get a spider, innocent little daddy long legs, and man, they are running, There are people that they're scared, right? Absolutely scared of certain things. That's phobia. And this word for fear here, when it says fear God, we're not supposed to fear man. It's a phobia. We are not to fear and to be a shaking of man, but we are to stand in fear, phobia of God. And you're thinking, wait, how does that work? If we're supposed to fear God, and then Jesus says, don't fear because God cares for you. And remember last time we went from the greater teacher down to the student, we went from greater to lesser. This time we're going to go from lesser to greater. Jesus is the master teacher. He says, think about sparrows. In their day, the sparrows were a poor man's meal because you could get 2 sparrows basically for a penny. And so there's not much meat on a sparrow, but they're everywhere. I mean, when I go into the jail, they're there. When you go out, any part of the country, you have these sparrows, little bitty birds. They're not always the prettiest of birds. They're just a little bird. And Jesus says, you know what? One of those birds that no one really pays attention to, they're kind of insignificant. Not one of them will fall to the earth without your Father knowing. God pays attention to what we think of as insignificant. And he says, you are far more valuable than many sparrows. So if God pays attention to something so insignificant and small, and you are worth far more than a sparrow, then don't you think he's going to pay much more attention to you? Yeah. So don't fear, because if I pay attention to the small, then I will pay attention to you, which is much greater. The second thing is he says, don't fear, because he knows how many hairs are on top of your head. Mm-hmm. This is, again, so insignificant to us. I mean, I don't know of a person, maybe there are, that count how many hairs they have on top of their head. We don't pay attention to that, right? We don't pay attention, but it shows that God knows all of the smallest details. Down to the very smallest detail, God is paying attention. Well, if God is paying attention to the very smallest details of even your hair, then doesn't it make sense that he's going to pay attention to all the other details in your life? The more important details, whether your job is going well, how your relationships are going, how your finances are going. Does Jesus care? Yes. So don't worry. God of all the universe cares about you. He knows every detail about you. So don't fear. You see, and ultimately Jesus is using fear. God gave us fear. It's an emotion that God gave us. He knows that we're motivated by fear. But Jesus is giving us a choice. He says, if you're going to be motivated by fear, then you better choose wisely. Because you're either going to be fearful of man or you're going to be fearful of God. And whichever fear is greater is what's going to control your actions. You see, whichever thing or person you fear more, that's the one that's going to control your actions. So if I fear man, and man says not to worship, then I won't worship. But if God says you're to worship, and I fear God more than man, then I'll say, I will worship. You see, that's the difference, is choose your fear. Which one are you going to fear is how we want to approach our lives. So as we get close here to the end, we see that God cares. We also see that Jesus cares. Don't fear because Jesus cares. And that's why, remember how he says, if you deny me, I'll deny you? The opposite is also true. If you confess me, I will confess you. You see, Jesus cares. And we can see how great that this life is. Jesus says that he is willing to come down and die for us. And you guys can look at some of the verses I put on there that Jesus lives to be your intercessor. And that's an amazing thought. He is your high priest. He cares. He cares. Do you believe that? Do you believe that? And number 3, why not to fear? Don't fear because God's promises are true. Not one of them has ever failed, and not one of them will ever fail. And one of the promises that he gives here in verse 39 is Jesus says, whoever loses their life ultimately for his sake, whoever loses your life for Jesus' sake, you'll find it. That's a promise. So don't fear. Even if they take your life, you will gain your life. Number 2, promise. He says, whoever gives will not lose their reward. Verse 42. That's some promises that we can take to the bank. You know, sometimes we're afraid that we're losing out here on earth. And Jesus says, no, you're not. Your reward is safe and you will not lose it. That's a promise. So don't fear. Don't fear that they're taking your house, that they're taking your job, that they're taking your reputation. All of these things. Don't fear. Jesus has given us 3 commands. Don't fear man killing your reputation. Don't fear man killing your body. Don't fear. 3 times he says it. But number 4 is, but fear God. Fear God, most importantly, and He's the one. Let's continue to depend on Him. Let God be our guide. Let Jesus be our strength during these times of difficulty. And remember that there is something far greater than death. There is something far greater than physical death to our bodies. And thousands of people every year are taking their lives. There are people right now contemplating suicide. And that's the other thing that we're going to find out later is because of the COVID shutdowns, the number of cases of depression, the cases of suicide, of mental health, they are skyrocketing because we're not allowed to be with people. We're not being around those who can comfort us and talk with us and hug us and be with us. Guys, as a church, we cannot be controlled by our fear of not being able to get out and reach people with the gospel of Jesus Christ right now. We've got to share it. We've got to share it. There are people truly hurting right now, and those numbers, I fear, are going to continue to rise as we continue to be separated. We've got to get the message out there. Bobby Yazzie died of COVID last week. So it's hitting close to home. It's not that this is not to take this lightly, please. But the funeral was a reminder of the importance of faith and family. If we neglect those things, we stop being with family, we stop being and pursuing our faith, then at death, what really matters? You see, what will really matter? Let's make sure that we are fearing God and not man. If you don't feel like you're right with God, if you know that you have not repented and put your faith in Him to say, I'm ready to follow you, then we need to make things right with Him. If you're ready to be baptized into Christ, let's make that decision today. Let's not wait. Right now, we're going to sing a song. And if it's anything that you need prayers or need to make things right with God, let's do it right now as together we stand and sing.